Have you ever wanted to play as a mephit or an imp? Or really any other monster, but you can't because there are only so many races in D&D. And then you can't go and make your own homebrew race because your DM doesn't allow homebrew. So what do? We reflavor and we reskin. And luckily, as always, I've done the work for you. In this video, we're going to take a look at the races from the player's handbook, seeing what kind of abilities and features they offer, and seeing what else we can reflavor them into, creating new opportunities for you and your table. Hello Acolytes, welcome to the Cleric Corner. My name is Riker, and here we talk about all things Dungeons and Dragons, tapping into our higher powers to create worlds more unique and stories more impactful. But two things before we jump into the reflavoring of Dragonborn. One, in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, they have custom lineages where you can take a feat to create a race that you can think of that doesn't fit any other racial option. But sometimes a feat just isn't enough and not quite what you're looking for in another idea that you may have. And that's when we turn to the regular races that we do have to see if there are other opportunities within them that we may have missed. And with changes to ability score increases in the same book, we're going to ignore that when it comes to reflavoring these different races. Number two, often when I make videos like this, people argue that we're breaking the game, but I want to emphasize that none of this is changing the mechanics at all. Of course, you can and you're perfectly free to tweak things a little bit to complete the idea that you're doing, but as far as what I am proposing here in this video, mechanics will stay the same. So bear with me, nothing breaking here. But always make sure to have a discussion, DM and player, to see how these races do fit into the campaign at hand. So are you ready? Here we go. Starting with the Dragonborn, I see a race that has two features. One, a dragon breath, and two, a damage resistance. So if we get rid of this Dragonborn title, what other creatures that have breath weapons can we be? Creatures like the Winterwolf, Chimera, Hellhounds, and Mephits, just to name a few. What if you were a Lupine or Werewolf race that got their lineage from Hellhounds or Winterwolves? Or turn your size to small and you're an actual elemental Mephit. Being an actual Chimera might be a little much, but your race could take on the form of one of their heads, maybe a lion, a snake, or a goat. Perhaps you're on a quest to reunite with all of your other heads that were separated from some hag's curse. Or just like the Draconic Blood Sorcerer, your bloodline could come from chimeras instead. And another great thing that comes with reflavoring is also tapping into other races from previous editions that didn't make the cut when it came to 5e. Your breath weapon could be a cold energy ray from a Dromite, or Maenad from the Eberron campaign setting. Or just change the breath weapon type to thunder damage and be a Vril, a goblin-like bat. But then again, what if you're just a normal human and somehow can breathe fire? Perhaps you're a fire breather from the circus and you just can innately do this, or you have oils and things that you can swallow and spew, you know what I mean? Or you're just a very anxious person, and when you confront something really scary, you spew chunks and it does acid damage. Or just take inspiration from the Skyrim setting where you look like any race and you're just blessed by the dragons and can do shouts or dragon breaths anyhow. Perhaps you're half a dragon literally and you have scales that come across your human skin. Or maybe you're a real dragon and you know how some can actually shapeshift back into humans? Maybe you got stuck in this form and need to figure out a way to get back to your regular magnificent form. But moving on to the Dwarf now, we look at a couple more features that the Dwarf gets, including weapon proficiencies and resistances to poison, as well as both ascertaining and working with different types of stone. With more features than the Dragonborn had, you might have a little less wiggle room to play with, but it still offers some great options. If you ever wanted more of a warrior variant to the Earth Genasi, this is your choice, especially if you go either mountain or hill dwarf subraces. You would just give up the few lower end spells that you would get with the regular Earth Genasi and trade it for something that would be a lot more impactful if you did make a melee character. A Briganock would also be a fun Fey type character that you can use the dwarf racial stats for, them being tied tightly to mining, and they also have some lore of the souls that inhabit outside of their bodies. Or you could just go as simple as someone with a backstory of stone masonry, and this is just an expansion of those features that you want to represent that. Or you can just go as crazy as actually being a Medusa with her hair snakes cut off, because obviously it would be way overpowered to turn other creatures into stone. One, it would make sense of why she's so familiar with stone, and two, you already have a built-in backstory of where did all the hair go. But you can see that using racial features doesn't always have to be flavoring just races, but the mechanics could also flavor what happened to you in your past. But if you choose the subrace Duergar, you have the spells Invisibility and Enlarge Reduce, as well as having advantage on illusion spells as well as charmed and being paralyzed. A Quagoth has similar spellcasting and poison resistances, and would also add a new element to the game. Add some savagery and madness to your character and you'll get a Darrow, or you can just use the advantage on illusions and be a spy mage that was specially trained against illusion casters. Pretty cool. And now we have the elf, but I'll also tie in half-elves because their abilities are really similar. We have proficiency in perception skills, as well as the inability to go to sleep by magical means and advantage on being charmed. They also have the ability that we all wish we had and can get a full night's rest within 4 hours instead of 8. Elves are basically the closest thing you can get to a fae without actually being fae, so you can actually flavor a lot of fae creatures as them. I'm thinking specifically a brownie or a duskling in previous editions. Duskling is to Incarnum as dryads are to nature. I'll get to what Incarnum is in a second. Or take a note from the dwarves, and instead of you being a spy mage trained against illusion spells, you're trained against charming or enchantment magic. If you go a high elf race, you also get a wizard cantrip as well as some extra melee weapon training, so I can think of 2 extra races that you can pull from 3.5, the Spell Scale and the Spiker. Spell Scales have the Blood of Dragons, but instead of breath weapons, they actually get additional magical abilities. And then a Spiker, a weapon specialist made entirely out of thorns that you can maybe put on a spiky armor outfit in order to complete the race. And then if you take the Drow race, you also get weapon training, but you also get spells like Dancing Lights, Fairy Fire, and Darkness. Great for a lot of Underdark creatures that are akin to the Drow. Mix your blood with demons for a Dragoloth, or mix it with Fae for the Darkling. Measles and Shadow Sifts are from the Shadowfell, but they also benefit from these features, giving you a plethora of lore to dive into. Another thing that you might relate to the Drow is their god Lolth. And what she did was cursed a lot of the Drow to become Driders. Now, unfortunately, there's no way to get both Web and Spider Climb as racial features, so you'll have to dip into spellcasting abilities in order to complete the next few ideas. But aside from being a Drider, you could also try to be a Choldrith, who are punishers for Lolth, or be a Chitine, creations of the Drow, or Ettercaps, who farm and shepherd spiders as we do sheep, and for some reason hate the Fae. But next we move on to the Gnomes, and they have 2 sub-races that both benefit from rolling advantage against spells with saving throws of intelligence, charisma, and wisdom. If we pick the Rock Gnome, we basically get expertise in history checks regarding magic items or technology, and also get a few tinkering abilities where we can make small toys. Now, unfortunately, these features are less racial and more cultural, and Wizards of the Coast tried to steer away from this in the recent Monsters of the Multiverse book, but unfortunately they missed the Rock Gnome. So Reflavor any race with experience with gadgets and gizmos, but also could be a start to your Forge Cleric, Creation Bard, or any Artificer. Perhaps you just use these features to explain more of your backstory being a toy maker or a Boy Scout. But with the Forest Gnome, we get the ability to cast Minor Illusion as well as Speak with Beasts. This allows a couple other racial options with similar abilities, including the Germlane, if I'm pronouncing that right, but a small Underdark creature, or a Svart, a cowardly godspawn of Gratz, who both actually have an affinity for rats and bats. Or you can look at the Redcap, who is a bloodlusty fae that prescribes to the idea that it's better to ask forgiveness than it is to ask permission. If you're wondering about the Deep Gnome and other sub-races not covered in this video, we're not covering it because it's the player's handbook, so it will be in a future video. That is, if this is actually a popular video. If this video doesn't get a lot of likes or comments, it tells me to ignore this and to move on to other things. So if you like this video and think it adds value, hit that like button and comment below on how you would reflavor these races. And then make sure you're subscribed because, of course, if I do continue this series, you'll be the first to know. And now, halfway through, we look at the Halflings. With advantage against being frightened, being able to go through creature spaces or hide in them if you're a Lightfoot, and then the most famous feature, Lucky, where you can re-roll ones. If you wanted to be any race, you could flavor these abilities as a Chronomancy or your magic over time, and include that in some of your subclass features. And then, of course, moving through other creature spaces, you could also kind of flavor as Etherealness, just for fun. But as far as races go, the most famous and closely aligned to the Halfling would be the Kender, who is most famous for the cultural kleptomania. It was actually highlighted in a recent Unearthed Arcana, but there was a lot of mixed feelings about it, so if that's just not your cup of tea, be a halfling and just say that you're Kender. A stout halfling also covers some poison resistances, and when I'm thinking about small creatures that may benefit from these kind of things, I thought about the Vegapygmy. I mean, who wouldn't want to be a small mushroom running around? Make him a Beastmaster, and you could also play around with his mushroom doggo there as well. But halflings also make great kid characters of any race, as they are also often mistaken by them anyways. And let's be honest, kids aren't afraid of anything. Speaking of halves of things though, we next come to the Half-Orc. And I know, my segue game is top tier. We have proficiency with intimidation. We have an extra dice that you can roll on crit damage, as well as the ability that when you get hit enough to reach 0 hit points, you can just instead choose 1. And to me, this ability feels a lot like Undead Fortitude, so many undead types could fit well in the Half-Orc stat block. Make it fun by being a zombie or a skeleton following your party around. But knowing the narrative of these abilities also stray towards being a strong and unrelenting force, you could also use these features to be a dwarf or a Goliath instead. Use it as an alternative to a dwarf that you knew didn't grow up around stone or stonework, so you didn't want those features. Or be a Goliath who didn't come from the mountains and so thus didn't have cold resistances, but instead are still a viable stick-to-itiveness force that most Goliaths have. If you didn't want to be a Goliath specifically, just choose another half-giant ogre or giantborn instead. Or just chalk up the abilities to any race and flavor them as just extra martial training that you had in the school growing up. Now, both the good and the bad thing of the next race, the human, is that it's a very clean slate. All it really does in the player's handbook is give you 2 options, 1 giving a +1 in all your ability scores, and 2 choosing your choice of feat. But then we're back and just discussing the custom lineage thing that I mentioned at the beginning of the video. But why don't we take a look at other human races that we did have in other editions? This gives you the opportunity to ask yourself, what do humans look like in this world? How are humans different? And do you have different races of different humans? In previous editions, we had the Rilken, who was a daredevil type always in the pursuit of perfection, but also was covered in patches of reptilian scales. Azarin humans were races that were born with their souls mixed in with Incarnum. Think a spiritual primordial soup. But this also caused them recklessness as well as really fast aging. If you think humans aged fast before, look at the Azarim. Next we have the Skarns, who are actually purposefully infused with Incarnum, resulting in reptilian spines that come out of them that they used in martial fighting. And then we have the race Devati, who are always born with twins, but not only in body, but with soul. 2 bodies, 1 purpose that shared 1 soul, so all intents and purposes was the same creature, but somehow always lacking a pupil and an iris, meaning total white eyes. So ask yourselves, how do you make humans different in your world? Play with the clean slate and make it your own. In contrast, we now have the spicy mechanics of the Tiefling to create some new and interesting flavors. In the player's handbook, we are only given 1 variation of the Tiefling, but this one having fire resistance, as well as the spells Thaumaturgy, Hellish Rebuke, and Darkness. But already being the fiery devil-born that they are, have you ever wanted to play as someone's familiar? Well, be an imp or a quasit, and just be that familiar that ran away from their wizard in their tower. A cackler is another demon that you can play, or you could play a Hellbred race. Hellbreds are individuals or humanoids that repented the moment that they were plummeting to hell. But because it was last minute, the gods decided to reincarnate them back into another life to see if they had a second chance, but then they picked up hellish powers on the way. But speaking of other planes of existence, you could be any individual that was influenced by the fire plane, perhaps a phoenix-born of sorts, or becoming an alternate version of the fire genasi or elemental if what the fire genasi option gave you wasn't quite what you had in mind. But play with your backstory and just ask yourself how you came to have these fire or hellish powers. Or you can just get a head start of your elven evocation wizard that's cast 1 too many fireballs. But whatever you use, just know that the lore and the names names of all of these races are just flavor text. They are optional descriptions of these races, but not prescriptions if you want to change the story and what these races look like. If you want to hear more about this mentality and why written archetypes in D&D are meant to be changed for the sake of creativity, check out this video. And then if you want to explore other racial reflavoring options, if I do continue this series, you can look at those here. But in the meantime, go out there and spread the good word of D&D and make the world a better place, both on and off the table. See you in the next one.